Happy New Year, everybody, and Tony here with my tribute to James Avery, who was born on November 27, 1945 in Suffolk, Virginia, and passed away on December 31, 2013 in Glendale, California, following complications from open-heart surgery. Before James Avery commenced his acting career in 1980, he served under the U.S. Navy during the Vietnam War from 1968 to 1969. Following his tenure, he wrote scripts and poems for PBS. He was also an alumnus of the University of California, San Diego, specifically in Thurgood Marshall College, where in 1976 he obtained his bachelor's degree in drama and literature. Being somebody who was born in 1992, especially now that I'm about to approach 30 in the next 4 months, I have associated James Avery in 3 roles. The Shredder from the 1987 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon, Chief Keewazi from Disney's The Legend of Tarzan, and of course, Philip Uncle Phil Banks from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. These 3 roles were, in my opinion, what encapsulated James Avery's repertoire as an actor. He stood at over 6 feet tall, and with his imposing height and his commanding voice, which is baritonal in color, he was able to specialize in a lot of villains, anti-villains, anti-heroes, fathers, grandfathers, and mentors. Even though he's very well known for portraying villains and father figures, his range is also impressively versatile. I may not have met James Avery in person, but there has been a litany of behind-the-scenes testaments where his co-stars, from Tatiana Ali to Will Smith to Joseph Marcel to Janet Hubert and to Daphne Maxwell Reid, stated that he was a gentle giant who was cultured and was so well versed in Black history, and he was also eloquent, charming, and absolutely nurturing to his co-stars. He was also somebody who loved jazz, and if I had met him in person, I would even testify that he would have been one of the finest people I have ever met. And to me, growing up with James Avery through the roles he's portrayed, he has become one of my greatest role models of all time. Whenever somebody thinks of James Avery and villains, they would always turn to the Shredder from the 1987 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon. James Avery embodied this warrior with so much venom, spite, intimidation, and fear that he was able to strike terror into those who dared oppose him. The venom that James Avery provided for the Shredder in his vehemence against the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was very palpable, and I felt every single enunciated word he produced. Sure, James Avery also portrayed his fair share of villains, but the Shredder remains top of mind to many a fan for his venom, his unparalleled skills as a warrior, his physical strength, as well as the determination he bears to want to destroy Leonardo, Michelangelo, Donatello, and Raphael, as well as Master Splinter. Therefore, one cannot go wrong with James Avery's absolutely imposing delivery as the Shredder. In Mr. Avery's roster of father figures, there is one particular father figure who I constantly believed deserved more love and more praise because of his wisdom, strength, and just how awesome he was, both physically and mentally, and he was none other than Chief Keewazi from the 2001 Disney cartoon The Legend of Tarzan, which was also a continuation of the 1999 animated movie Tarzan. There is no doubt that I always tuned in to Disney's The Legend of Tarzan specifically for the episodes revolving around the Waziri tribe as well as Opar. But I always found myself going back to the Waziri tribe episodes because I found myself developing this AU headcanon I had in store for Tarzan ever since I was a 9-year-old watching this. Ever since Chief Keewazi and Basuli made their debut in Tarzan and the Poison River Part 1, a question popped in my mind that asked me, what if Tarzan were raised by Chief Keewazi and had Basuli as his older brother? That was when my AU headcanon sparked, and my reasons were that I always believed that Chief Keewazi was a strong, sagacious, courageous, and absolutely powerful father figure despite his age catching up to him. But even with that age catching up to him, Chief Keewazi proves himself to be a formidable combatant, especially when he disarmed Ian McTeague, a greedy businessman, by pairing McTeague with his staff, thus having his knife drop at the river. And it was through that moment that made me appreciate Chief Keewazi more and made me wish that Chief Keewazi had a lot more love, specifically fan art, fan fiction, and just more fan appreciation because of just how formidable and just how sagacious he is as not only a Waziri chief, but also as Basuli's father. There is no doubt that I've always tuned into the Waziri episodes to see Basuli and Tarzan match each other in terms of their strength. And let's also not forget about my most favorite moment when it came to Basuli and Tarzan. After Chief Keewazi commands Ian McTeague to leave their jungle alone after he disarmed him from using his knife with his staff, Ian McTeague swears that he will return rich, and he remarks that the Waziri tribe will continue to be poor. Basuli and Tarzan retort by saying that they could live with it, with Tarzan agreeing, and wouldn't you know it, Tarzan and Basuli let out a huge roar that could make even the most courageous of lions and the fiercest of leopards shake under their fur. And it was also at that moment that made me salute Basuli and Tarzan as brothers. But what are two powerful jungle brothers without an equally powerful jungle chief father to make sure that his sons grow well in strength and in character? That's where Chief Keewazi comes in. Yes, Chief Keewazi might have had a total of 4 episodes that he appeared in, namely Tarzan and the Poison River Parts 1 and 2, Tarzan and the Fountain, and Tarzan and the Eagle's Feather, but James Avery's delivery of Chief Keewazi made me root for him as a father figure and made me root for Chief Keewazi as one of my most favorite father figures that I have seen in animation. It also made me entertained with the idea of Chief Keewazi being an equally great father to Tarzan and not just Basuli. Whereas the challenge and fun where you get to raise one son when 2 sons could be just as fun, challenging, interesting, and just as memorable. Sure, Tarzan might have had a strong parent-child relationship with his adoptive gorilla mother Kala, but the same could not be said for Kerchak until the very final moments of the film. But Chief Keewazi, in my eyes, would be the type of father who is going to unconditionally love both Basuli and Tarzan as his sons. He would be someone who will remind Tarzan that it doesn't matter what color his skin is. What matters is that he is his son through and through, and nobody, I mean nobody, could ever separate the bond that they have together. It's also through my AU headcanon that I was really happy that Tarzan had a brother and a father through Basuli and Chief Keewazi. Chief Keewazi would be the type of father who would make sure that Tarzan grows not only in strength and fierceness, but also in wisdom, as well as taking charge of the Waziri tribe, thus having both Basuli and Tarzan rule side by side should Chief Keewazi's days as chief come to an end. And it's through James Avery's portrayal of Chief Keewazi that made me root for this particular father figure and made me believe that he could be just as great of a father to Tarzan as he is to Basuli, thus making me convict that Chief Keewazi, Basuli, and Tarzan could definitely make for a strong, virile, and absolutely loving family who are tight-knit and will never leave each other's side, thus showing the fierce loyalty they have for each other and making sure that they are the best versions of themselves every single time. And in terms of Chief Keewazi as a father, he would never take crap from both Basuli and Tarzan in terms of their antics. He'll always make sure that they are straightened out, but he will nevertheless love them and encourage them to be the best versions of themselves. And he could even recognize their differences, with Basuli being the traditional warrior who is all strength and might, and Tarzan, who uses his animal prowess combined with his strength and athleticism to make him a complete warrior, thus encouraging both Basuli and Tarzan to learn from each other and therefore accept each other for who they are as brothers. Therefore, Chief Keewazi has always been the father that not only Basuli has, but also Tarzan deserves because of his sagacity, his strength, and his courage. And James Avery knew how to pull all the stops when it came to portraying this particular authority figure. But no tribute to James Avery would ever be complete unless I talk about Uncle Phil, or real name Philip Banks, from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. This was the role that solidified him as an actor. This was a role that solidified him as someone who specialized in authority figures, fathers, and mentors. And this was a role that showed that James Avery deserved my respect as an actor. And he was not only a father on screen, but he also took that fatherly love off screen, especially when it came to Karen Parsons' experience with James Avery, as he always called her daughter, lest we forget about how Tatiana Ali remarked that James Avery was her teacher. And of course, the love of music that he had that made The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air absolutely awesome in its legacy. Highlighted by Daphne Maxwell Reid, who remarked that James Avery loved jazz. And he was also passionate about talking about the Black experience, thus making James Avery as Uncle Phil somebody to emulate. The very first episode demonstrated that yes, he might have been initially irritated with Will's antics, considering that Will was transported from his native Philadelphia to live with Uncle Phil and Aunt Viv in Bel Air, California. But their first showdown demonstrated that Phil did not go soft, but he remembered what it was like to grow up on the streets. And he even remarked to Will that yes, Will has a poster of Malcolm X on his wall. And when he uttered that he heard the brother speak, and when he uttered that statement, this demonstrated that Uncle Phil not only knew about Malcolm X, but he also read about him. He also read everything Malcolm X wrote. He listened to his speeches. He capitulated everything that Malcolm X was defined by. Because just like Will, he also grew up on the streets of Baltimore and experienced just as much racial discrimination, hatred, bigotry, and all these social issues that encroached what would have made the United States of America quote-unquote united. He lived through those times of strife and times of animosity that he has been also dealing with to this very day as a lawyer and eventually judge in the later seasons. And when Uncle Phil mentioned that Malcolm X was a brother, James Avery mentioned in a New York Film Academy lecture that as African Americans, they are bicultural and bilingual, so they can manage to enunciate each and every vowel and consonant to near perfection. But at the same time, they can slip back and say some slang, especially enunciated by some sounds, like brother, mother, and sister. Therefore, that first showdown between Uncle Phil and Will in the very first episode illustrated that The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, when it comes to the Black experience, was not just about the clothes and the trends and the music. It was also about the human experience of what occurred and the struggle Black Americans had to undergo in order to attain equal rights as well as liberty. But the system has proven time and time again that Black Americans may not always acquire those same rights as the white population. And it's that moment that Uncle Phil reminds Will that he has never forgotten where he came from. Yes, he might have studied in Princeton. Yes, he might have ended up becoming a lawyer with a mansion, happily married to a beautiful wife, and has 3 biological kids of his own. But he has never forgotten what it was like to grow up with bigotry, hatred, animosity, and racial discrimination, thus reminding Will that before he dares judge somebody, he better have a thorough understanding of what that person could be going through. Especially noteworthy was when Will played Beethoven's Fiordalice on the piano does Uncle Phil see some potential in his nephew slash surrogate son that he could make something greater of himself? Speaking of the Black experience, mistaken identity also showed James Avery at his finest as Uncle Phil. Sure, Janet Hubert also had the strength and the audacity as Aunt Viv, especially when she remarks to the policemen, with one of them being portrayed by Hank Azaria, by stating that their incompetence is much higher than the police force in Mayberry RFD, if not higher. Even when one of the policemen demand that Aunt Viv go sit down, Uncle Phil retorts by commanding them that he dare not talk to his wife like that. Even when his legal partner, Mr. Firth, arrive to see what the commotion is about, Uncle Phil makes a statement that would make any police officer question of what they're doing is right, and maybe reevaluate how they should perform better, and maybe make the police force realize that it's not always the people that they catch, but mostly their system. And it's through Uncle Phil's verbal smackdown that he addresses the policemen's wrongdoings by making them realize that they did not even bother to call any lawyer or any parent, because Uncle Phil and Aunt Viv are their lawyers as well as their parents. Especially when Uncle Phil demands the policeman to open up that cell door, or else they would be attacked with so much litigation that their grandchildren are going to need lawyers. And when Uncle Phil states that it's not just Carlton who is his kid, but also Will who's his kid, that's what made me salute Uncle Phil as a true father figure. Sure, it'd be easy to portray Uncle Phil as this high-strung, overly demanding, and overly commanding father who wants to make sure that his house is in tip-top shape every single time, and he constantly demands so much from his kids and his wife. But what makes James Avery as Uncle Phil so strong is that he also embodied this character with unconditional love. Sure, he may be annoyed with Will's antics. Sure, he may not always like it when Will gets himself into all these schemes, but he's always going to be there for him every single time. And there's even a behind-the-scenes story in which, during the casting of The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and although Benny Medina casted Will Smith to be the titular hero, there was also the casting of the parents. And when James Avery saw Will Smith and demanded from Will that he take his feet down whenever he's sitting down, that was when James Avery was automatically casted as Uncle Phil. And it's for that reason that James Avery as Uncle Phil managed to be one of television's greatest dads of all time. I would even go out of my way and say that Uncle Phil is my most favorite TV dad of all time, and he's able to mop the floor with all the other TV dads' heads from past to present. And one can never forget about the physical comedy that James Avery as Uncle Phil ended up doing. Sure, we cannot forget about Uncle Phil throwing Jazz out the door every time Jazz said or did something stupid or unnecessary, but we cannot forget about his other gestures as well as the mimicry that he managed to implement in his performance as Uncle Phil. What about that evil laughter when Uncle Phil threatens a harsher punishment on Will, only to find out 3 years later that he's finally gotten the perfect medieval-style punishment suitable for Will? Or what about his appearance on Family Matters, which would have made for a nice crossover episode, especially when Gary Leroy Gray's character emphasized that Reginald VelJohnson's Carl Winslow does look like the father from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, i.e. Uncle Phil. And who better to come in than James Avery himself, shooting a glare stating, "Is this for real?" Only for James Avery and Reginald VelJohnson to be so happy to see each other even after Reginald bursted with laughter. And these two TV dads ended up being locked in a nice hug as Reginald VelJohnson announces to the audience, "Ladies and gentlemen, James Avery," which left me with a huge smile on my face. Speaking of TV dads, yes, Dr. Cliff Huxtable, portrayed by Bill Cosby, might have been America's best dad of all time, but that position has always been, now and forever, and will always be challenged by Uncle Phil, portrayed by James Avery. Sure, Dr. Huxtable might seem charismatic and also has sagacious advice to his children and can be just as loving to his wife, but Uncle Phil manages to do all these things a whole lot better by being a strong authority figure, as well as ensuring that his family stay as strong together forever. He can also have his tender moments with Aunt Viv, most notably when it comes to Janet Hubert portraying her. Sure, he does have his moments with Daphne Maxwell Reid as Aunt Viv, but the intimacy and the passion between Uncle Phil and Aunt Viv are far more palpable when it came to Janet Hubert's portrayal of this iconic mother figure. And he may be firm on his kids, but he's also unconditionally loving to them and wants to see them shine in every way possible. Even though Hillary dropped out from college, she was still able to prove herself to be a capable and resourceful young woman who ended up starting her own talk show. Carlton definitely grew from the advice Uncle Phil gave him, and Ashley grew up to find her own path in her life, thus making sure that Uncle Phil trusts her. But even if Uncle Phil is a firm, unconditionally loving, and strong father to his 3 biological children, this love that he has for his biological children does not compare to the love that he has for his own surrogate son/nephew, Will. This is especially emphasized in Papa's Got a Brand New Excuse from season 4. I'm sure that those of you who have this episode ingrained in your mind and your psyche will automatically start bursting into tears, especially in that final moment. And even if Daphne Maxwell Reid as Aunt Viv was able to throw in the first punch by giving an ultimatum to Lou Smith, portrayed by Ben Vereen, that should he ever abandon Will again, he should never be permitted to return neither to Will nor to the family. It's ultimately James Avery as Uncle Phil who was able to give the father, no pun intended, of all smackdowns to Ben Vereen's Lou Smith. It starts off with Uncle Phil demanding that Lou Smith sit down and reminds Lou that since Will is in his life, he ought to be there for him. And even though Lou tries to fabricate an excuse that they'll still take the trip, Uncle Phil calls him out on his crap by stating to him that Will is not a coat to be hung and be waited to be worn, because Will's life goes on. It's Lou that's supposed to be there for Will, not Will being there for Lou. And just as Lou stands up by being defensive, there was something that made me feel that James Avery as Uncle Phil was able to make Ben Vereen's Lou Smith look like a midget. Just like the same moment that James Avery's Uncle Phil was able to make Hank Azaria's policeman look like a midget. That is just how strong of an actor James Avery was, especially when he emphasizes to Lou that he should just cut his excuses because, yes, Lou might have been scared, but he was too cowardly to ever stay with Will, whereas with Uncle Phil, he stayed with his family through thick and thin, and he was man enough and brave enough to stay with them every single time, through times of trial, tribulation, and even in times of joy. He was able to stay with his family until the chips were down, unlike Lou, who chose to run off. Even when Lou deflects all this by claiming to Phil that he's the better man, Phil's not buying it, and he's not even gonna do his dirty work by telling Will that he's just going to leave without him. It was also very clear in this episode that both Uncle Phil and Aunt Viv knew that Lou was going to be trouble, especially when it came to that new job deal that he had. No sooner does this all happen when Will comes in and ends up calling his biological father only by his first name when Lou addressed that changes of plans occurred. This also led us, the viewers, to witness the most iconic yet most tear-jerking scene in all of Fresh Prince of Bel-Air history. First, Will tries to act cool about it, but he then unleashes a tirade that his father was never there for him and had to learn how to drive, shave, fight, and shoot basketballs without him, and even screaming to hell with him at Lou. Just as Will was about to walk away, still angry and frustrated, Uncle Phil tears up for Will, as Will tearfully inquires, "How come he don't want me, man?" Only with that tearful inquiry does Uncle Phil hug Will and comfort him, thus ending the episode in a somber manner as the camera zooms to the African statue that Will purchased, supposedly for his father, but this time it's for Uncle Phil, the man who has always been a father to him. This scene was also just as important for Will Smith to demonstrate his skills as a dramatic actor, but it was also the influence that James Avery had on him. Sure, James Avery might not have known who Will Smith was, but when it came to strengthening Will's craft as an actor, he definitely delivered, and it was that moment that secured him as a fine actor and someone who could be surprisingly serious in his roles. Yes, we have all known the character Will Smith as this Joker, but he does have his serious moments, and this was the pinnacle. This not only demonstrated that the actor Will Smith could also handle tender material. And it was also in an interview that during the filming of the scene that Will Smith was so flustered and furious and totally all over the place, but James Avery kept reminding Will, look at me, don't act around me, act with me. And when Will Smith was at his most vulnerable, and once James Avery came in with that hug, he whispered to Will Smith's ear, that's acting. Thus showing that Will Smith gained James Avery's approval, which was not an easy thing to do. But that scene demonstrated that not only was there the strong and true and genuine father-son bond between Uncle Phil and Will, but also the moment that made two thespians thoroughly respect each other in James Avery and Will Smith. Even as the camera zooms in on that statue, you might have heard someone crying in the background, and that somebody was none other than Karen Parsons. She even remarked how unexpectedly devastating it was because they did not expect it to go down like this. Even this scene had a long-lasting impression on Ben Vereen because he could not begin to tell how many times women yelled at him for leaving Will Smith like that. And for all of what Uncle Phil's high-strung personality had to offer, and in terms of him losing his temper whenever somebody does something stupid or foolish, Uncle Phil is nevertheless the father that not only Will needed, but I'm sure a lot of us watching The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air needed in our lives. Whether we were boys growing into men or girls growing into women, Uncle Phil, embodied by James Avery, was always that one father figure who could give you sage advice and make you reflect on certain actions that might have been uncalled for, but will nevertheless welcome you home into his arms and say how proud he is for what you've been accomplishing thus far. Therefore, Uncle Phil might tend to be high-strung, but when it comes to his paternal duties and his spousal duties, he will always be there for his children, and he will always love them no matter what. And he will also be there to support his wife and make sure that his family remains under one roof. Even as The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air closes with season 6, he even reminds Will that he is never going to lose them, for Uncle Phil is Will's father. End of story. When all is said and done, Uncle Phil is that father we, growing up with The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, all needed in our lives, and one that we will always salute with all our hearts, minds, and souls. And it's not just cartoons, television shows, and movies that James Avery was so well known for. He was also an advocate for education, specifically when he was a spokesperson for Virginia State University. That commercial will always stick with me because of how much James Avery emphasized that talent is something that we have in ourselves and something that we will continue to search within ourselves. But too often, talent is wasted. Talent is something that is taken for granted. And it is up to us to constantly sharpen, hone, and make sure that our talents do not go to waste. And it's also up to us to make sure that we keep discovering our talents and make sure that we live to our full potential. These were pearls of wisdom that I have managed to take in and accept into my being and into everything I do, thanks to the Virginia State University advertisement on YouTube. And it's through James Avery's words that made me as the viewer accept it. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, my tribute to James Avery. He was not only well known for villainous roles like the Shredder from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon of 1987, but also fatherly roles and roles that demand strong authority like Uncle Phil from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and Chief Keewazi from Disney's The Legend of Tarzan. Through James Avery's roles, he has become one of my most treasured and cherished role models, to the point where I have learned so much from him, and he has therefore helped me become the man I am today. And I salute James Avery with all of my being, and I just hope that his legacy will continue to live on forever and ever. And for those of you who have been following James Avery's career, what did you think of him? Was there a role that you really loved from him, and one that you thought was the perfect role for him, to the point where every time you associated that role with James Avery, you automatically go back to the character? Was there a particular character trope that you loved James Avery in, whether it be villains or anti-villains, or father figures, authority figures, and mentors? Was there a role that made you inspired to be the person that you are today, whether it's Uncle Phil and his strong sense of duty and love to his children and his family overall, or Chief Keewazi and his sense of duty as both a father and a chief to his tribe? Or is there a role that you thought wasn't particularly ideal for James Avery? Comment below and let me know. Well, that's it for my tribute to James Avery. Tune in much later for my tribute to Will Smith's and Janet Hubert's reconciliation on the Red Table Talk. So until then, Happy New Year, everybody!